kicking, I thought that, I start with some definitions, but maybe I'll ask you first to write in the chat or on a postcard or something, whether you've come across with these terms, these sort of crop growth models, data simulation, and that stuff, and what they mean to you, if they mean anything at all or not, and then that helps me to know a bit more about the audience. But anyway, I'll carry on with my definition. So, some important things that people might not be aware of is this kind of biophysical parameters, which basically is like a measurable magnitude of something that describes something you're interested in. And these are things like soil moisture, the area index, it would be something like sort of albedo or pigment concentrations or things like that. A rate transfer model is a physical model that basically describes the sort of scattering absorption of photons by a medium. And by a medium, we basically mean the soil, vegetation, and atmosphere on top of it. Usually, rate transfer model is basically being fed by physical parameters, and it predicts reflectance or backscatter or brightness temperatures or something like that. In general, what we want to go is we want to go from the reflectance or backscatter or something like that back to the LAI or chlorophyll or soil moisture or whatever it might be that you're interested in. So we generally use them in this sort of reverse mode. Crop growth models are basically fundamentally just a set of equations that describe processes that are then used to predict the temporal evolution of a crop. So basically, you've got things like photosynthesis, carbon partitioning, kind of water and nutrient sort of movements through the plant and so on and so forth. And basically, they have, this works as a function of the genetics, environmental factors like drivers like meteorology and so on and so forth, and management choices. And data simulation is basically a set of mathematical techniques that allow us to sort of combine imperfect observations. So remember that we have to basically get these biophysical parameters of interest from a very sort of indirect measurement of scattered photons or things like that. So it will be highly uncertain. And also, we want to blend this with these sort of predictions of the same thing coming up from the crop growth model. So it's a way of basically getting an optimal analysis of those two things. This is like your standard crop growth model kind of diagram. So we've basically got some drivers, which are basically, the kind of meteorology, information about the soil types, and so on. We've got some management information, fertilizer, irrigation, things that Farmer John does to the crop. And then the crop model will basically have a set of equations that basically describe the water and nutrient cycling. So we'll basically look at things like sort of photosynthesis, evapotranspiration, and so on and so forth, and how they're coupled to crop processes in terms of phenology, partitioning of the assimilated carbon to different organs and things like that, and and ultimately we'll also have some idea of stresses. So nitrogen deficiency, possibly pest, possibly some other things. So that's pretty much what a crop growth model does. This is an example of the output. This is actually example from Warforce, and basically what you get out of it is if you run it for a site, you basically get time series of state variable, things that describe the state of the crop at any given time. For example, we've got LAI here. This is basically run with different parameterizations. We also got sort of different weights of organs, so leaves, stems, roots. We got root depth here as well. We've got fluxes, so this is canopy water transpiration. This is soil moisture. So they do predict a lot of things. These things. I mean, they're great. They seem to predict everything about a crop. Why bother with that observation then? These models seem to predict everything. But the fact is that, generally speaking, they're pretty rubbish. They're very complicated models. We've got loads of processes. Each of those processes needs to be parameterized. But not only that, the assembly of these processes needs also to be parameterized. And that includes change to the scale from leaf to the canopy and so on and so forth. So that adds a lot of parameters. And the drivers we use to write these things are basically sort of quite coarse resolution. It's meteorology, coarse soil maps, and things like that. So we don't necessarily have the detail for the granularity we see in the actual realized fields. You need to do local calibrations, and because of this issue of highly nonlinear models with loads of parameters, the more models are actually sort of having a worse time generalizing um, to a broad range of conditions. And there's sort of difference in how they do stresses, how they simplify processes, and so on. So there's quite a bit of a large uncertainty in any prediction you're going to get with these things for any given crop, unless it's being particularly tailored for one particular field. So the role of EO here is basically the crop growth model predicts something, and then we can basically sort of hit it with a stick with observations and say, no, you're getting it wrong, go back to where it should be, and we can basically try to keep the model in track. And that's possibly the most obvious way to combine these two things. A more ambitious way is to basically think, well, if we've got we've got a model that basically combines all these heterogeneous kind of observations in terms of a crop, then we could use that to interpret our data. So for example, we got data from an optica and a microwave sensor. We can basically sort of start to make sense of things like LAI trajectories, soil moisture trajectories, above ground biomass trajectories in terms of yield or in terms of sort of limiting factors for the crop. But the crop growth model needs to be sort of consistent with the observations, and have to have enough processes for that kind of complexity. So how does it work? And this is basically what the data assimilation stuff goes. It's basically data assimilation is just like another name for Bayesian statistics, and there's loads of methods which are just basically sort of applications of Bayesian statistics. It's just basically different assumptions. But the main kind of two families of things we have is like a filter or a smoother. A filter basically is this idea of whacking the model, correcting it as observations come sequentially online. And then a smoother basically takes over a longer time window and basically takes all the observations at the same time. And it's more like a kind of change the parameters of the crop growth model so it matches the observation. So an example of a filter is here. The sort of gray area is our initial model prediction. You can see they has massive error bars. It's all the gray area there. We got some observations in orange. They're the dots, and they come from this idealized kind of truth, which is the full line. And then when we have a filter, what we see is that whenever we get an observation, the model basically tracks the observation, but then between the observations, it uses the original model, which we know is wrong, to actually propagate them. So, it's a bit of, you hit it with it's a punch and Judy thing that you basically hit the thing and then it all grows away following the model. So not necessarily best for most applications. Variational or smoother things basically aim to reparameterize the model. In this case, I'm just showing you the original and the observations, and then the green line is basically the analysis, which is basically which we've changed from this sort of single hole model to something else. We're basically reparameterizing the model to be more consistent with the observation. So the model parameters here have changed. We learned something from this kind of exercise. This is a more practical example, Sentinel-2, the Waffles crop growth model, and we're targeting yield. So, what we do is we draw loads of replications of the crop growth models with different parameters, different sort of uncertainties in drivers. And this is basically what's giving out these thick kind of lines here. It's loads of them. And these are different representations of the model. We've got a couple of observations in red here, and this is like a histogram of the yield at the end of the campaign. If we get more observations, we're basically discarding some of them which are inconsistent with the observed LAI, and then you can basically see that this has now hopefully narrowed a bit. We're throwing away things which don't make sense. And then over at the end, we just basically select a handful of these trajectories and we narrow down the yields. This is LAI, and this is for most people. This is from a review paper. You can basically see that most people have sort of latched onto LAI because it's a fundamental variable into these things. There are some sort of examples of using soil moisture, but generally speaking, LAI is what most people have been using. And this is a bit sort of depressing because we are now getting loads of information from things like Sentinel-2, and we need to use them. So there's some challenges with optical Earth observation. There's clouds all the time, particularly if you live in the UK. I mean, we've been told there's a sun here, but we haven't seen it for 2 weeks. There's never enough band, so you always need to use. People moan about hyperspectral. There's never enough resolution, so people will moan about that. And ultimately, even with something like Sentinel-2, it's really hard to work with long time series over large areas because of sort of storage issues. So, there's some challenges that we need to overcome. But there are also some sort of simplifying factors for crops. We can assume it's a continuous canopy. There's a bit of a row structure, but it's not as sort of exaggerated as the one you get in vineyards, for example, as shown before. We know that the scene is a crop. We know we're looking at a pixel that belongs to a crop. In many cases, we actually know that the crop is going to be wheat or barley or whatever it might be. And we can assume there's a time series available over the growing season. It's not particularly useful to look at individual data points. You just basically have to take all the data together as a time series. And then, somebody has done the atmospheric correction for you and hopefully sort of propagated the uncertainties as well. So this is what you can get. These are basically 3 fields. One is maize, winter wheat, and winter triticale in Germany. And this is just using Sentinel-2 data with an archetype retrieval scheme. This is from a recent paper we got just literally a couple of months back. And the red dots are basically the field measurements over the growing season. The non-red bits are basically our estimates of parameters with uncertainties over the same growing season from Sentinel-2. You can see we're getting things like LAI, chlorophyll. I think this is leaf water, dry matter, the brown pigment, canopy water content, canopy dry matter content, and even the average leaf angle distribution is retrieved over time. So you can get all these from free data you can just download off the internet using the basically they're all the parameters of the prospect and sale models bundled together. You don't actually need a lot of observations when you have this kind of retrieval scheme based on these archetypes. This is an example of Monte Carlo example of starting the model and just basically leaving 2 observations up to, I think it is 20 observations here. So you can see that when you get like, something between 10, 12 observations, you pretty much are there in terms of describing the entire dynamics of, I think this is LAI, but it's something similar for chlorophyll and for the other parameters. So, there seems to be a lot of data you can get from Sentinel-2 that that we're not really making use of. You can also use this data to predict any other optical sensor. So, for example, we are predicting in situ hyperspectral measurements that were collected at the same time over the growing season. You can see that we're doing pretty well. We can predict the hyperspectral data pretty well, except at at the very beginning and at the very end, because we don't really have a specialized soil reflectance model for it. This is basically the kind of statistics for 2 of the field, the winter and the maize field, are pretty much similar for the other fields investigated. We're basically sort of explaining most of the hyperspectral variance based on Sentinel-2 data, which kind of makes sense. You don't need that many bands to explain the parameters of sale and prospect than the ones that you sample from Sentinel-2. So you don't necessarily need any more spectral sampling. So just to quickly finish off, they consider crop growth models as a way to coherently bring in different sets of heterogeneous observations. I mean, I said mostly work with satellites, but these could also be things that are kicking about in the field, IoT kind of things, and to basically make sense of them in terms of an agronomic kind of problem. We've got very rich and frequent sampling of the of different biophysical parameters from some of the optical satellites. That's only just getting better. We're going to get better resolution. We're probably going to get better spectral and radiometric sensors with time. So, but we still have a lot of useful stuff available right now. The limitations are basically that some of these crop growth models lack processes to accommodate some of these things. So, for example, we do not yet have a very clear mechanistic understanding of how some of these leaf pigments are actually affecting, photosynthesis and so on and so forth. So, for example, anthocyanins might have a sort of protective effect, but how does that translate into uh, limitations in photosynthesis or limitations in partitioning or things that are basically happening in the crop. Similarly, most of these things will not have a concept of, they will calculate gross primary productivity, but what they don't have is something that allows you to sort of directly calculate fluorescence. So you have to basically go through GPP and then on to fluorescence, which is a bit of an indirect link. Similarly, for temperature, they might not have the ability to calculate sort of temperature in some cases. And we also have this problem that if we want to apply these crop growth models to, for example, to infer yield or something like that over large areas, we need some form of localization. We need some local calibration. We need to understand what kind of processes are basically sort of making things change. So, my second thing is like a bit of a call to arms, and this is something that I've been spending a bit of time on, is that we need new crop growth models that are designed to be consistent with EO data. So the crop growth models that people have done in the past are interesting because people look at the effect of climate change, they look at, changes in management and things like that, but they don't necessarily take into account the fact that, you've got all these information to constrain them. So they're probably overcomplicated. You don't necessarily need to have a lot of the detail. That is very much in most of these models fairly empirical and not necessarily well, very generalizable or very sort of, elegant in a way. But we need to have something that is compatible with our retrieval scheme. So if we're basically looking at canopy interception of radiation, we should be using the same kind of assumptions that we use to retrieve these biophysical parameters. So we need to basically ensure that the models are consistent. And we need to have enough processes that describe the EO measurements. I basically said that, we don't have some of these processes available, so we might need some hypotheses to test. I think this is like a pretty cool area to look at these things. Yeah, that's me. That's the end. Thank you.